The pool pump hummed its final death rattle as Marcus watched 20,000 gallons of crystal-clear water cascade down his driveway. Across the street, Karen's voice pierced the morning air like a siren. "You're destroying our entire neighborhoods. Water table! I'm calling the police!" What she didn't know was that her own pristine lawn was about to reveal a secret that would make his pool drainage look like a drop in the ocean and turn her righteous fury into the most expensive mistake of her life. Marcus Chen had owned the house on Maple Grove Drive for exactly 18 months, and in that time, he'd learned 3 immutable truths about suburban living. Sprinklers always break on Sundays, garbage trucks come 15 minutes early or 2 hours late, and Karen Whitmore from across the street had opinions about everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across his backyard as Marcus surveyed the cracked concrete surrounding his kidney-shaped pool. The liner had finally given up after what the pool company estimated was 30 years of faithful service, splitting along the deep end like a fault line. Green algae bloomed in patches where the filtration system had lost its battle against nature. "Well, old girl, time to put you out of your misery," Marcus muttered, connecting the discharge hose to the main drain. He'd done his homework. City ordinances allowed pool drainage with proper permits, which he'd obtained 3 weeks ago after jumping through enough bureaucratic hoops to qualify for the Olympics. The environmental impact assessment had been clean, the drainage route approved, and his contractor scheduled to begin renovations Monday morning. The pump kicked to life with a mechanical wheeze, and water began its journey from pool to storm drain. Marcus settled into his patio chair with a cup of coffee, watching 20 years of pool parties and summer afternoons disappear down the drain. Literally. That's when he heard the front door slam across the street. Karen Whitmore emerged from her colonial like a general preparing for battle, her silver hair pulled back in a bun so tight it could crack nuts. She wore her usual uniform, pressed khakis, a polo shirt that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly grocery budget, and the expression of someone who'd just discovered a personal affront to the natural order. She marched across the street, her sensible shoes clicking against the asphalt with military precision. Marcus set down his coffee, recognizing the storm clouds gathering in her pale blue eyes. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Karen's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to compliance. "Morning, Karen. Just draining the pool for renovation." Marcus gestured toward the permits taped to his sliding glass door. "All above board." "Above board?" Her voice pitched higher. "You're pumping thousands of gallons of chemically treated water directly into our storm system. Do you have any idea what that does to the water table?" Marcus bit back his first response, opting for diplomacy. "Actually, I had the water tested. Chlorine levels are well within safe parameters and—" "Safe parameters?" Karen stepped closer, her voice rising to a volume that could alert the neighborhood watch 3 blocks away. "I've lived on this street for 27 years, young man. I was on the environmental committee that got those storm drains installed. I know what's safe and what isn't." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that someone who watered her lawn daily during drought restrictions was lecturing him about water conservation, but he'd learned that pointing out Karen's contradictions was like trying to teach algebra to a hurricane. "I understand your concern," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But I've followed all the proper procedures. The permits are right there if you'd like to." "Permits?" Karen's laugh held no humor. "You think a piece of paper from some desk jockey, downtown supersedes environmental responsibility? That water is going straight into Willow Creek, which feeds into the reservoir. You're poisoning our entire water supply." Marcus glanced toward the storm drain where his pool water was flowing, in a steady stream, crystal clear and odorless. He tested it himself with a kit that cost more than dinner for 4 at his favorite restaurant. The chlorine levels were lower than most municipal water supplies. "Karen, I appreciate your concern for the environment, but—" "Don't you, Karen." "Me?" Her face flushed crimson. "This is exactly the kind of entitled behavior that's ruining this neighborhood. You move in with your loud music and your late-night construction projects, and now you're literally draining poison into our groundwater." The accusation stung because it was fundamentally unfair. Marcus had been nothing but considerate since moving in. He'd introduced himself to every neighbor, kept his music at reasonable volumes, and scheduled all his renovation work during approved hours. He'd even helped old Mr. Peterson next door repair his fence after the last windstorm. "Look," Marcus said, standing to match her energy, "I've done everything by the book. Water's been tested, permits obtained, proper drainage route approved. If you have concerns, you're welcome to file a complaint with the city." "Oh, I'll do. Better than that?" Karen pulled out her phone with the flourish of someone drawing a sword. "I'm calling the police. What you're doing is illegal dumping, and I won't stand by while you destroy our community." Marcus felt his diplomatic facade cracking. "It's not illegal dumping. It's permitted pool drainage. There's a difference." But Karen was already dialing 911, her voice shifting into the performance mode Marcus had witnessed during her legendary complaint calls about everything from dog walkers who didn't carry bags to teenagers who dared to exist in public spaces. "Yes, I need to report environmental crimes in progress," she announced into the phone, her voice carrying across the street. "My neighbor is dumping thousands of gallons of chemically contaminated water into our storm system. Yes, I'll hold." Marcus watched in amazement as Karen began pacing his driveway, treating his property like her personal stage. Several neighbors had emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion like moths to a particularly dramatic flame. "She's at it again," he heard Mrs. Rodriguez mutter to her husband. "Third time this month," Mr. Peterson added from his garden. But Karen was in her element now, speaking into the phone with the passion of someone reporting a terrorist attack. "Officer, I need someone here immediately. This is an environmental emergency. He's destroying our entire water table." Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not anger exactly, but a crystalline clarity about who he was dealing with. This wasn't about environmental protection or community standards. This was about control, about a woman who'd appointed herself, the neighborhood's unofficial dictator, and couldn't tolerate anyone operating outside her sphere of influence. "Yes, I understand you have other priorities," Karen continued, her voice sharp with irritation, "but this affects the entire community's drinking water. How is that not a priority?" The pool continued draining steadily, each gallon carrying Marcus closer to his renovation timeline and Karen further from rational discourse. He could see the exact moment she realized the police weren't treating her call with the urgency she expected. "Fine," she snapped into the phone. "But I want it on record that I reported this environmental catastrophe before it contaminates half the county's water supply." She ended the call with enough force to crack the screen, then turned to Marcus with eyes that could melt steel. "They'll be here within the hour," she announced, though her tone suggested otherwise. "And when they see what you've done, when they test that water and find out what you've been hiding, you'll wish you'd listened to me." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. There was something in her tone, a confidence, that went beyond mere neighborhood authority. Karen wasn't just making empty threats. She genuinely believed she had ammunition that could destroy him. "What exactly do you think I'm hiding?" he asked. Karen's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Oh, honey, you have no idea what I know about this neighborhood's water systems. No idea at all." She turned and walked back toward her house, her stride confident and purposeful. But instead of going inside, she headed around to her backyard, disappearing behind the privacy fence that bordered the creek. Marcus stood alone in his driveway, watching the last of his pool water spiral down the storm drain, and couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something much deeper than a neighborhood dispute. Karen's parting words echoed in his mind, carrying implications he couldn't quite grasp but definitely didn't like. The pool pump gave one final wheeze and fell silent. 20,000 gallons gone. And somehow, Marcus suspected, that was just the beginning. Marcus couldn't concentrate on the contractor meeting that afternoon. Jake Morrison, owner of Morrison Pool and Spa, spread renovation blueprints across the patio table while pointing out features of the new liner system. But Marcus's attention kept drifting to Karen's backyard. She'd been back there for hours, and the occasional sound of digging carried over the fence. "You listening, Marcus?" Jake's weathered face creased with concern. "This is the part where I tell you about the additional costs." "Sorry." Marcus forced himself to focus. "Additional costs?" Jake pointed to a section of the blueprint marked in red. Found some irregularities when we tested the soil composition around your pool deck. pH levels are way off, more acidic than they should be for this area. We'll need to treat the ground before we can install the new liner system. Marcus frowned. What kind of irregularities? Hard to say without more extensive testing, but it's like something's been leaching into the soil over time. Could be old fertilizer runoff, could be something else. Jake shrugged. Point is, it'll add about $3,000 to the project. Before Marcus could respond, his doorbell rang with the aggressive persistence of someone who expected immediate attention. Through the front window, he could see a police cruiser parked on the street. I'll be right back, Marcus told Jake, wondering if Karen had actually managed to convince someone that pool drainage constituted an environmental crime. Officer Sarah Martinez stood on his front porch, notepad in hand, and an expression that suggested this wasn't her first Karen Whitmore call of the week. She was younger than Marcus expected, probably early 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Mr. Chen, I'm here about a complaint regarding water drainage from your property. Of course you are. Marcus stepped outside, leaving the door open. Let me guess. Karen Whitmore called about my pool? Officer Martinez's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Mrs. Whitmore has expressed concerns about potential environmental violations. Mind if I take a look at what we're dealing with? Marcus led her around to the backyard, where Jake was rolling up the blueprints. The empty pool looked like a concrete crater, its walls stained with years of water lines and algae growth. This is Jake Morrison, Marcus said. He's the contractor handling the renovation. Jake, this is Officer Martinez. Jake stood and shook her hand. Afternoon, officer. Hope there's no problem with the permits. Everything's been filed properly. I'm sure it has. Martinez walked to the edge of the pool, then followed the hose to where it connected to the storm drain. Mrs. Whitmore claims you dumped chemically contaminated water into the municipal system. Pool water, Marcus said. Tested and within all safety parameters. I have the results if you'd like to see them. Martinez nodded toward Jake. You handle a lot of pool drainages? Dozens every year. Standard procedure. Jake pulled out his phone and showed her photos of official test results. Water's cleaner than what comes out of most people's taps. A crash from Karen's backyard made all three of them turn toward the sound. It was followed by creative cursing that would have impressed a sailor. Mrs. Whitmore's been working on a project back there all day, Marcus observed. Officer Martinez walked to the fence line, where gaps between the slats offered glimpses of Karen's yard. What she saw made her frown. Mr. Morrison, you said the soil around Mr. Chen's pool showed unusual acidity. That's right. Pretty significant deviation from normal levels for this area. Martinez was quiet for a moment, studying the fence. Then she pulled out her radio. Dispatch, this is Martinez. I need you to run a check on 4247 Maple Grove Drive. Any environmental violations or permits on file? Static crackled before the response came. That's a Karen Whitmore residence. Shows multiple complaints filed by her, but no violations or permits registered. Copy that. Martinez clipped the radio back to her belt and turned to Marcus. Mr. Chen, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Have you noticed anything unusual about your water quality since moving in? Taste, smell, anything like that? Marcus thought back to his first few months in the house. Actually, yeah, the water had a metallic taste at first, but I figured it was old pipes. Had a plumber check everything when I moved in. What did he find? Said the pipes were fine, but recommended I install a whole house filtration system. Figured it was a sales pitch, but the taste was pretty bad, so I went ahead with it. Jake was studying his soil test results with new interest. Officer, what exactly are you thinking? Martinez didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked back to the fence and peered through the gaps again. Mrs. Whitmore is digging some kind of trench back there. Pretty deep one, from what I can see. Another crash echoed from Karen's yard, followed by what sounded like metal hitting concrete. I think I need to have a conversation with your neighbor, Martinez said. Mr. Chen, I may need you to stick around for a while. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Karen's voice rose from her backyard. No, 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 this cannot be happening. Martinez was moving before the words finished echoing. She strode to Karen's front door and knocked with authority. Marcus and Jake exchanged glances, then followed at a respectful distance. Karen answered the door looking like she'd been wrestling with a garden hose and losing. Her clothes were muddy, her hair had escaped its bun, and there was something close to panic in her eyes. Officer Martinez, she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Please tell me you've arrested that environmental criminal across the street. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to see what you're working on in your backyard. The smile disappeared. I beg your pardon? You filed a complaint about water contamination. As part of my investigation, I need to examine all potential sources in the area. That's completely unnecessary. The contamination is obviously coming from his pool drainage. Ma'am, I need to see your backyard, now. Karen's face cycled through several emotions before settling on indignant cooperation. Fine. But I don't appreciate the implication that I'm somehow responsible for that man's reckless behavior. She led them through her immaculate house, past family photos and motivational quotes about living your best life. The backyard, however, told a different story. Karen had dug a trench roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet deep alongside her back fence. The excavation had exposed what looked like a concrete channel running parallel to the property line. But it was what was inside the channel that made Officer Martinez reach for her radio again. Corroded metal barrels, at least a dozen of them, were embedded in the concrete like some kind of toxic time capsule. Several had split open, their contents having leached into the surrounding soil over what looked like decades. The smell was unmistakable, chemical and sharp, like turpentine mixed with battery acid. Jesus Christ, Jake breathed. Marcus felt his knees go weak. How long have those been there? Karen was backing away from the trench, her face pale. I had no idea. I was just trying to install a French drain to protect my foundation from all the water you dumped. Officer Martinez keyed her radio. Dispatch, I need environmental response and hazmat at 4247 Maple Grove Drive immediately. We have multiple compromised chemical containers leaching into groundwater. She turned to Karen with an expression that could freeze fire. Mrs. Whitmore, how long have you lived at this address? 27 years, Karen whispered. And you're telling me you had no knowledge of these barrels? Of course not. Do you think I'd live on top of toxic waste? But Marcus was putting pieces together, remembering conversations with neighbors about the house's history. Karen, didn't you buy this place from some kind of manufacturing company? Mr. Peterson mentioned it was a corporate property before you moved in. Karen's silence was answer enough. Martinez was already coordinating with dispatch, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone dealing with a major environmental incident. I need soil and water testing for a 6-block radius, full hazmat protocols, and get me everything on file about the previous owner of this property. As she spoke, Marcus realized the horrible irony of the situation. Karen had spent the morning accusing him of poisoning the neighborhood's water supply while standing directly above the actual source of contamination that had been leaching into the groundwater for decades. Jake was studying his soil test results with grim understanding. The acidity around your pool, Marcus. It's probably been migrating underground from here. Your pool water wasn't the problem, it was diluting the real problem. Karen sank onto her patio chair, the fight drained out of her. I bought this house because it was such a good deal. The company was motivated to sell. What company? Martinez demanded. Hartwell Chemical Industries. They said they were downsizing, moving their operations out of state. Karen's voice was barely audible. The price was half of comparable properties. Marcus felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. 27 years of Karen lecturing neighbors about environmental responsibility while unknowingly living on top of a chemical dump site. 27 years of contaminated groundwater flowing toward Willow Creek. 27 years of her righteous fury directed at everyone except the actual source of the problem. Officer Martinez closed her notepad with a snap that sounded like a gavel. Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to evacuate this property immediately. This 3 weeks later, Marcus sat in the law offices of Brennan and Associates, watching Karen Whitmore's lawyer desperately try to salvage what was left of his client's life. The conference room's mahogany table was covered with environmental reports, property assessments, and enough legal documents to deforest a small nation. My client had no knowledge of the contamination, Attorney James Brennan insisted, his expensive suit unable to hide the desperation in his voice. She was as much a victim as anyone else. Environmental attorney Lisa Chang, representing the neighborhood class action lawsuit, didn't look up from her tablet. Mrs. Whitmore ignored multiple red flags over 27 years. Unusually cheap purchase price, prior industrial use, documented health complaints from neighbors, and her own admission that she knew the previous owner was a chemical company. Marcus studied Karen across the table. She looked like she'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. The woman who'd once commanded neighborhood meetings with imperial authority now seemed to shrink into her chair. Her house had been condemned, her property declared a Superfund site, and every neighbor within a 6-block radius was demanding compensation for decades of exposure to contaminated groundwater. The EPA preliminary report is damning, Chang continued, sliding a folder across the table. Benzene, trichloroethylene, heavy metals, all at levels that exceed safe drinking water standards by factors of 10 to 50. The contamination plume extends throughout the entire neighborhood. Mr. Peterson, who'd joined the lawsuit after his wife's mysterious illness suddenly made sense, leaned forward. My Margaret had that strange cough for 15 years. Doctors couldn't figure out what was causing it. Now we know. Karen's voice was barely audible. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. But you suspected, Chung pressed. You installed 3 different water filtration systems over the years. You complained to the city about unusual taste and odor. You even had your well tested twice. The tests came back inconclusive, Brennan protested, because your client had them tested for common contaminants, not industrial chemicals. She never disclosed the property's history to the testing company. Marcus felt a mixture of sympathy and anger watching Karen's world collapse. Part of him wanted to feel vindicated. She'd tried to destroy his life over illegal pool drainage while sitting on a genuine environmental disaster. But seeing her reduced to this broken shell of her former self was somehow worse than satisfying. The door opened, and EPA Regional Administrator David Wells entered with 2 federal agents. The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mrs. Whitmore, Wells said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, we need to discuss your cooperation with our criminal investigation. Criminal investigation. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Criminal? Karen's voice cracked. I told you I didn't know about the barrels. Agent Sarah Reeves opened a file that looked thick enough to stop bullets. Mrs. Whitmore, we've been investigating Hartwell Chemical Industries for illegal dumping practices dating back to the 1980s. Your property is the 7th site we've discovered where they buried industrial waste instead of properly disposing of it. What does that have to do with my client? Brennan demanded. Agent Reeves smiled without warmth. Because we have evidence that your client was paid significantly more than the purchase price of her home to keep quiet about what she found. The room went silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and Karen's shallow breathing. That's impossible, Karen whispered. Is it? Reeves pulled out a bank statement. Hartwell Chemical made payments to your account totaling $150,000 over the past 27 years, always in December, always labeled as consulting fees. Care to explain what consulting services you provided to a company that supposedly moved out of state? Marcus watched Karen's face cycle through shock, fear, and something that looked like resignation. The woman who'd spent decades positioning herself as the neighborhood's environmental watchdog had been taking money to stay quiet about the very contamination she'd later blame on everyone else. They said it was for property maintenance, Karen stammered. Compensation for any inconvenience from the previous industrial use. Inconvenience? Chang's voice could have cut glass. Mrs. Whitmore, you've been taking money to cover up environmental crimes while your neighbors got sick from contaminated water. while children played in yards poisoned by industrial waste. While families trusted you as their advocate for neighborhood safety. The full scope of Karen's betrayal was staggering. She hadn't just been an unwitting victim, she'd been a paid accomplice in a decades-long cover-up that had poisoned an entire community. Mr. Peterson stood up so abruptly, his chair toppled backward. You knew. All this time, you knew our water was poisoned, and you said nothing. It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone, Karen's voice broke. They told me the containment was safe, that it wouldn't spread. 27 years, Peterson's voice shook with rage. 27 years of my wife breathing poison, drinking poison, while you collected your blood money and lectured us about environmental responsibility. Agent Reeves was making notes. Mrs. Whitmore, accepting payments to conceal environmental hazards is a federal crime. You're looking at conspiracy charges, environmental terrorism, and potential accessory charges if we can prove the contamination contributed to any deaths in the area. Karen buried her face in her hands. I needed the money. Do you know how expensive it is to maintain a house on a fixed income? The payments help me keep up with everything. Keep up with what? Marcus asked, speaking for the first time. You drove a new car every 2 years. You remodeled your kitchen twice. You took those expensive trips to Europe. I earned that. Money, Karen snapped, some of her old fire returning. I kept my mouth shut and maintained the property value for the entire neighborhood. The audacity was breathtaking. Even now, facing federal charges and civil lawsuits that would bankrupt her, Karen was trying to frame her betrayal as community service. Chang was already calculating numbers on her tablet. Mrs. Whitmore, the preliminary damage assessment for neighborhood property values alone exceeds $2 million. Medical costs for affected residents could reach $5 million. Environmental cleanup is estimated at $15 million. Your homeowner's insurance explicitly excludes coverage for environmental contamination, and your criminal liability voids any protection from civil suits. Marcus did the math. Karen was looking at financial ruin that would extend beyond her lifetime. Even if she sold everything she owned, it wouldn't cover a fraction of the damages. There is one way to potentially reduce your liability, Agent Reeves said. Full cooperation with our investigation of Hartwell Chemical. Names, dates, documents, recordings, everything you have that can help us prosecute the executives who orchestrated this cover-up. Karen looked up with the desperate hope of someone offered a life preserver in a hurricane. What kind of cooperation? Testimony. Wearing a wire. Helping us gather evidence against the people who paid you to stay quiet while they poisoned your neighbors. The irony was perfect. Karen, who'd spent her life reporting on neighbors for minor infractions, was now being asked to become an actual informant against real criminals. If I help you, Karen asked, what happens to me? You'll still face charges, but cooperation could reduce your sentence from 20 years to 5. Reeves closed the file. And it might help you sleep at night, knowing you finally did the right thing. Marcus watched Karen wrestle with the decision. Her entire identity had been built on being the neighborhood's moral authority, the one person who held everyone else accountable. Now she was being forced to confront the reality that she'd spent decades as the neighborhood's greatest threat. I'll do it, Karen whispered. I'll help you get them. As the meeting broke up and lawyers scheduled follow-up sessions, Marcus found himself walking out with Karen. They stood in the parking lot, two neighbors who'd been at war that morning, and now shared the strange bond of having survived a mutual disaster. Marcus, Karen said, not meeting his eyes. I know this doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I said about your pool, and I'm sorry for what I did to the neighborhood. Marcus looked at the woman who'd made his life miserable for 18 months, who'd called him an environmental criminal while being paid to cover up actual environmental crimes. He should have felt satisfaction at her downfall, but instead, he felt something closer to pity. Karen, he said finally, I hope you get the chance to make this right. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and walked toward a car that would soon be repossessed. As Marcus drove home, he realized that justice wasn't always as satisfying as he'd imagined it would be. Sometimes it just looked like a broken woman facing the consequences of choices that had seemed reasonable at the time. 1 year later, Marcus stood beside his newly renovated pool, watching his daughter splash in water so clean it sparkled like liquid diamonds. The federal cleanup had been thorough: new water mains, soil remediation, and monitoring systems that would track water quality for the next decade. What had started as a neighborhood disaster had become a model for environmental restoration. "Daddy, look!" 8-year-old Emma executed a perfect cannonball that sent water cascading across the deck. "I'm a mermaid!" Marcus laughed, remembering when that same pool had been a cracked concrete crater that nearly ended his suburban dream. The renovation had cost twice the original estimate, but federal victim compensation had covered most of it. More importantly, the water was finally safe. His phone buzzed with a text from Officer Martinez, now Detective Martinez. "Hartwell executive sentenced today. Thought you'd want to know." Marcus opened the news article she'd attached. The headline read, "Chemical Company Executive Sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for environmental conspiracy." The photo showed 3 men in expensive suits being led away in handcuffs. Karen had been true to her word. Her cooperation had provided the evidence needed to prosecute the executives, who'd orchestrated the illegal dumping scheme. Her testimony had been devastating. Recordings of phone calls, emails discussing cover-up strategies, and detailed accounts of how Hartwell had systematically bribed property owners to stay quiet about contamination. "Mr. Chen?" A familiar voice made him look up from his phone. Karen Whitmore stood at his gate, looking older, but somehow more at peace than he'd seen her in years. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a t-shirt from a local environmental cleanup organization, and carried a small gift bag. "Karen." Marcus set down his phone, unsure what to expect. "How are you?" "Better than I deserve." She glanced at Emma, who was now attempting synchronized swimming with an inflatable unicorn. "She's beautiful. I heard you got full custody." Marcus nodded. His ex-wife had finally agreed that Emma would be better off with him full-time, especially after the environmental cleanup had made the neighborhood safer than it had been in decades. "I wanted to thank you," Karen said, her voice steady, "for not pressing additional charges. The prosecutor said you could have, but you didn't. You were facing enough consequences already." Karen looked at the pool, then at the house where she'd lived for 27 years. A new family had moved in after the extensive remediation, a young couple with twin toddlers who were thrilled to have a backyard that was finally safe for children. "I got 3 years," she said quietly. "Minimum security, mostly community service and environmental restoration work. I'll be cleaning up contaminated sites for the next decade." "That seems..." Marcus searched for the right word. "Appropriate. The ironic part is, I'm actually good at it. Who knew that decades of obsessing over environmental violations would make me useful for environmental cleanup?" She managed a weak smile. "I've learned more about actual environmental science in the past year than I learned in 27 years of complaining about it." Emma climbed out of the pool and ran over, dripping wet and curious. "Daddy, who's this?" "This is Mrs. Whitmore, Em. She used to live across the street." "Oh!" Emma's eyes lit up. "Are you the lady who helped find the bad chemicals?" Karen's expression softened. "I suppose I am, in a way." "My teacher says you're a hero because you helped catch the bad men who were poisoning the water." Marcus felt his throat tighten. Emma's third-grade teacher had simplified the story for her class, focusing on how Karen's cooperation had led to the arrests and cleanup. It wasn't wrong exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth either. "I'm not a hero, sweetheart," Karen said, gently. "I made some very bad choices, and I'm trying to make up for them now." "But you did help catch the bad guys, right?" "Yes, I did help with that." Emma nodded sagely. "My daddy says everyone makes mistakes, but what matters is what you do after." Karen looked at Marcus with something that might have been gratitude. "Your daddy sounds very wise." After Emma ran back to the pool, Karen pulled the gift bag from her purse. "I wanted to give you this. It's not much, but Inside was a simple frame containing a photo of Maple Grove Drive from the 1990s, before the environmental cleanup, before the federal investigation, before everything changed. The street looked exactly the same, but Marcus knew that appearances had been deceiving. "I found it in my photo albums," Karen explained. "I thought you might want to remember what the neighborhood looked like before we all learned the truth about what was hiding beneath it." Marcus studied the photo, seeing his house in the background, young and optimistic. "Why give this to me?" "Because you were right to drain that pool. You were right to follow the proper procedures and get the permits and do everything by the book. I spent so much time looking for violations where they didn't exist that I missed the real one happening right under my feet." Karen's voice grew quiet. "I want to remember that being right doesn't always feel good, but it's still important to be right." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Emma practice her backstroke in water that was cleaner than anything the neighborhood had seen in decades. "The Hartwell money," Karen said suddenly. "Every penny of it is going to the victims' compensation fund. My lawyer says it won't cover even a fraction of what people are owed, but it's something." "That's good of you." "It's the least I can do." She paused. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "That morning when you were draining the pool, if you had known what it would lead to, all the investigations and lawsuits and people getting sick, would you have done it anyway?" Marcus considered the question. His pool drainage had uncovered decades of contamination, but it had also destroyed lives, bankrupted families, and revealed betrayals that had torn the community apart. Even the happy ending, clean water and restored property values, had come at an enormous cost. "Yes," he said finally, "because the alternative was letting the contamination continue. People were getting sick, Karen. Children were drinking. Poisoned water. Whatever pain came from exposing the truth, it was less than the pain of living with the lie." Karen nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I used to think I was protecting the neighborhood by keeping quiet, but I was really just protecting myself. We all protect ourselves sometimes. But some of us call the police on our neighbors for legally draining their pools while we're taking money to cover up actual crimes." Karen's laugh held no humor. "I spent so many years being angry at everyone else for not meeting my standards that I forgot to hold myself to any standards at all." Emma called from the pool. "Daddy, can Mrs. Whitmore stay for dinner? I want to show her my underwater handstands." Marcus looked at Karen, seeing not the neighborhood tyrant who'd made his life miserable, but a woman who'd lost everything trying to make amends for choices that had seemed reasonable at the time. "Would you like to stay?" he asked. Karen's smile was genuine for the first time in years. "I'd like that very much." As the sun set over Maple Grove Drive, casting long shadows across lawns that were finally safe for children to play on, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all to this point. A simple pool drainage had revealed a conspiracy that stretched back decades, destroyed lives, and ultimately made their community stronger than it had ever been. The water in his pool was crystal clear, free from the contamination that had poisoned the neighborhood for a generation. But more than that, it was honest water. No secrets hidden beneath its surface, no lies lurking in its depths. Sometimes Marcus thought, as he watched Emma teach Karen the proper form for a cannonball, the most important thing you can do is drain the pool and see what's really underneath. Even if what you find changes everything you thought you knew about, where you live, and who you trust. The truth might be messy and painful and expensive, but it was also the only foundation strong enough to build a real community on. And sometimes, if you were very fortunate, it was the beginning of clean water for everyone.